What's the good word? Gospel. So as we've been doing in this series, I'm going to read a couple passages and I'm going to use the original Greek word like an annoying preacher would. Now I would remind you, brothers and sisters, of the euangelion that I euangelismon to you, which you in turn received, in which you now stand. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to euangelistai to the poor. So this word euangelion is where we get the words evangelist, evangelism, and it's the same word can work as a noun and a verb. So the way one of my teachers would talk about it, you would say, like Paul says there in 1 Corinthians, the gospel that I gospeled you. And it's both a message about Jesus and a message from Jesus. Now, typically when we talk about the gospel, in my experience, most of the time we only emphasize the message about Jesus, which, and a lot of times it's just about his death and resurrection, which is what Paul is talking about there in 1 Corinthians. But sometimes that can lead into what I call the bad news approach to evangelism, of good news telling, which is basically to say, well, you're destined to burn in hell forever, but Jesus is your get out of hell free card. If the good news, if the gospel really is good, you don't really need to emphasize the bad very much. You already kind of know what the bad situation is, and the good news speaks to that, right? If you are at the hospital and the doctor comes to you and says, hey, I've got good news, you probably know what the bad situation is, and that should be how we talk about the gospel as well. Jesus' death and resurrection does defeat the power of sin and death, and of course, that is good news. And that's overcoming the final death that we all will face someday at the end of our earthly life, but it's also about overcoming the little deaths that we face and endure in this world, individually and I think as a whole. So the little losses, the sufferings that we go through, that's all things that are addressed by this good news. And as Jesus himself proclaims in that sermon in Nazareth, it's good for the poor, here and now. This idea of the gospel being from Jesus and about Jesus, it really comes together in the idea of declaring that Jesus is king. Gospel is actually a political word, because in Jesus' own time, the Caesars of the Roman Empire would proclaim their own good news, their own gospel about Roman rule, about Roman victories, about Roman peace. That was a peace that came through violence. And so early Christian evangelists were actually doing something countercultural by preaching an alternative form of good news, which was politically dangerous for them to do. The earliest use of this word in Scripture in the Old Testament comes from Isaiah, and it's a passage that talks about the good news is that God reigns. And so the gospel is ultimately about someone who is on the throne. When we say we believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ, we're saying we believe that Jesus is king. Jesus is the one on the throne. We have faith that that means he's making things right in the future someday and also right now. So, how can we be a part of this good news? How can you spread it in your words and your actions today?